The islands of the Pacific were small on the map, but to the men who stepped onto their shores, they felt like entire worlds, made of fire, mud, and death. The war between Japan and the United States did not begin in the sands of Tarawa or the black ash of Iwo Jima. It began, long before, in the minds of two nations who believed the other would break first. Japan believed America was soft, a nation of comfort, a land where men grew up far from hardship. They believed their soldiers, by the blade of Bushido wood, overwhelm any American force that dared to cross the Pacific. But they were wrong, and they learned it in the most brutal way possible. From the Marines, the Japanese soldiers expected the Americans to hesitate, to fear pain, to collapse under the weight of a relentless empire. Instead, they encountered men who refused to run, men who advanced even when surrounded, men whose footsteps shook the jungle floors. With a stubborn fury the Japanese had never imagined, the Marines did not fight for glory or imperial pride. They fought for something colder, harder, more primal. They fought because the man beside them had to live. They fought because turning back meant letting the ocean swallow the world behind them. And as the battles grew fiercer, the Japanese began to realize the terrifying truth. The more they tried to break the Marines, the more unbreakable those Marines became. By the time Japan understood what kind of fighters the Marines truly were, it was too late. Island after island burned. Garrison after garrison disappeared beneath naval thunder. The Japanese soldiers whispered among themselves in dugouts and caves, their voices trembling when they spoke of the enemy in the green utility uniforms. These were not ordinary soldiers. These were not men who surrendered. These were not men who feared death. When the Marines landed, the battle was no longer about who would win. It became a question of who, if anyone, would survive. And that, fair and spoken yet undeniable, spread through the Japanese ranks like a shadow that no amount of discipline could erase. It began long before the first Marine raised a rifle against a Japanese soldier. In the 1930s, Japan expanded across Asia like a rising storm, convinced it was destined to dominate the Pacific. Their officers studied ancient codes of honor. Their soldiers trained to die without hesitation. And their leaders believed the Americans were too comfortable, too distracted, too divided to mount a meaningful fight. Bushido, the warrior code, was drilled deep into every recruit. Death was honorable. Surrender was shameful. Loyalty was absolute. They built an army around this belief, confident that no foreign army could match the resolve of a soldier who considered himself already dead. But across the ocean, a very different kind of warrior was being forged. The United States Marine Corps, although smaller in number, had spent decades sharpening itself into an elite force that thrived in hardship. Their training pushed men to collapse, then demanded they stand again. Their rifles were not just tools, but extensions of their will. And their identity was carved from a simple creed: Marines don't quit. It didn't matter if they were outnumbered, outgunned, were caught in the firestorm of a hopeless fight. They held the line because history demanded it, because the Corps demanded it, because their brothers beside them depended on it. When the war erupted across the Pacific, the Japanese believed they would sweep across the islands unchallenged, and early victories gave them confidence. They conquered territories quickly, deeply convinced that American spirit would crumble. What they did not anticipate was the force that would arrive. When the Marines finally came, the Japanese soldiers saw the first signs at Guadalcanal. They attacked at night with bayonets and shouted as they charged, expecting the Americans to panic. Instead, they found Marines who held their ground, who fired with cold precision, whose discipline did not falter even when the jungle erupted in screaming chaos. Japanese officers were stunned. They reported back to Tokyo that these Americans were not what they had been told to expect. Night after night, Japanese forces launched attacks, believing they could overwhelm the Marines through sheer ferocity. But they found an enemy who fought with a different kind of fury, one that did not come from ancient codes or imperial propaganda. It came from survival, from grit, from a stubborn unwillingness to let comrades die. When dawn broke, the jungles were silent except for the distant echo of artillery. Bodies lay scattered across muddy fields, and the Japanese soldiers stared at the unshaken Marines with a mixture of disbelief and dread. As weeks turned to months, stories began to spread through Japanese ranks. Tales of Marines who kept advancing even after being wounded. Marines who crawled through mud with broken legs just to pull a friend behind a tree. Marines who charged machine gun nests with nothing but grenades. In the rage of men who refused to accept defeat, the Japanese began to realize something they had never imagined. These Americans fought like men who expected to die, but refused to accept death without taking the enemy with them. Japan's commanders studied reports and became increasingly alarmed. They had believed their own soldiers were the most disciplined in the world. But these Marines, these rugged, relentless fighters, showed a discipline that came not from fear of officers, but from loyalty to each other. Every island deepened the fear. The Marines landed into walls of machine gun fire so heavy that the sea turned red. The whispers of fear that ran through American ranks during the early Pacific War did not rise from numbers or strategy. They rose from encounters. Raw, human, unforgettable encounters. The kind that left even the toughest Marines silent when the night rolled in. The kind that made commanders rethink everything they knew about warfare. The kind that made a generation of Americans believe that Japanese soldiers were not merely opponents, but something far more relentless. The jungles of Guadalcanal became the birthplace of this belief. Rain hammered down like nails from the sky, thick mud-swallowing footprints as soon as they were made, and the scent of rot lingering beneath every leaf. Yet somewhere within this hellscape, the Japanese soldiers seemed to thrive. They didn't just hide, they evaporated into the jungle. They didn't retreat, they repositioned, and they didn't fear death. They welcomed it, if it meant taking an American with them. American Marines, fighting on the bridges and riverbeds, soon realized that these enemies fought differently than anything they had studied. They did not break ranks under artillery like European armies. They did not surrender when surrounded. Instead, they waited silent as predators until darkness crawled across the earth. Then the jungle came alive, with the slicing whisper of bayonets, with sharp cries that pierced the night like torn metal, and with footsteps that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The Marines learned, painfully, that the Japanese soldiers were trained from childhood to believe surrender was worse than death. They were raised inside a culture that glorified sacrifice, a code older than the United States itself. The Bushido spirit, duty, honor. Death before dishonor was not a slogan. It was etched into their bones. So, when they fought with a spiritual weight that Americans had never encountered. Yet this fanatic courage was also fueled by something more immediate and more ruthless: military indoctrination. From the first day of training, Japanese recruits were forced through a brutal system designed to crush weakness, increase pain tolerance, and build unquestioning loyalty. Senior soldiers beat juniors daily, sometimes to the brink of collapse. But this cruelty forged a terrifying unity. It created men who could march through monsoon rain on empty stomachs, who could go 3 days without food, who could fight even when wounded, and who could smile at the thought of dying for their emperor. These behaviors were not rumors. They were witnessed, documented, and remembered by Marines who had stared into the eyes of soldiers who refused to fall, even after absorbing wounds that should have ended them. American medics often approached a wounded Japanese soldier only to be met with a hidden grenade clutched against his chest, pulled not to kill the medic, but to take one more enemy to the grave. The Marines learned to approach slowly, rifles raised, hearts pounding. In every skirmish, they found evidence of an enemy who prepared to die before the battle even began. Letters written to families, personal items wrapped neatly in cloth, final messages carved into pieces of wood. It shook the Americans, not because they feared death, but because they faced an enemy who had already accepted his, and that changed the psychology of every confrontation. In the tunnels of Saipan, Wounded Japanese soldiers hid in the darkness, waiting to explode grenades beneath American boots. Snipers tied themselves to trees so they could continue firing even after death stiffened their bodies. On Peleliu, Marines advanced only inches at a time because every shadow, every cave, every ridge concealed a soldier who would rather die than yield a single piece of earth. Every island became a lesson, brutal and unforgettable. And yet, the deeper the Marines pushed across the Pacific, the more they understood that this hatred, this ferocity, was not personal. It was cultural conditioning, imperial propaganda, and years of indoctrination merged into a single vision. America was the enemy that must be destroyed for the empire to live. This, more than anything, made the Japanese fight like ghosts of vengeance. The war changed its tone as the Marines approached the Japanese homeland. Every island closer to Japan revealed a new level of desperation, a new depth of fanatic commitment. The Japanese high command no longer expected to win, they expected to make victory too costly for America to accept. On Iwo Jima, the Marines encountered a fortress carved beneath the earth. Entire cities of tunnels ran below volcanic rock, manned by soldiers who obeyed only one order: inflict maximum casualties. When American tanks rolled forward, invisible gun ports opened in the ground, spitting fire. When Marines captured one hill, another rose behind it. When they thought they silenced a bunker, the enemy emerged from another entrance and began the assault again. Even after the famous flag raising on Mount Suribachi, the island bled for weeks. Japanese soldiers came crawling out of tunnels long after. The battle was considered won. One Marine recalled, finding a badly wounded Japanese officer sitting upright, sword clutched to his chest, waiting for a final moment to strike. He died, with his hand still gripping the blade. By the time the Marines reached Okinawa, the largest amphibious invasion of the Pacific War, the Japanese launched a final, desperate form of combat: mass civilian mobilization, suicidal counterattacks, and underground resistance that turned the island into a slaughterhouse. Okinawa was not just a battlefield, was a warning of what the invasion of Japan would become. The Japanese leadership prepared every man, woman, and child to die fighting. American intelligence predicted casualties in the millions. The Marines felt the weight of what lay ahead. They had fought across oceans, jungles, mountains, and ash-covered wastelands. They had faced soldiers who fought to the last breath, who refused surrender even when defeat was certain. They came to understand that Japanese hatred of American forces was not born from personal anger, was built through decades of militarism, indoctrination, and cultural pressure. They were taught from childhood that death in service of the emperor was sacred, that surrender was shameful, and that Americans were monsters who would destroy Japan. This belief pushed ordinary men into extraordinary extremes. And yet, as the war neared its final days, the Marines began to see fragments of humanity amid the smoke. Prisoners taken late in the campaign were frightened boys, many barely trained, trembling at the sight of American soldiers because they expected torture or execution. When the Marines treated them kindly, fed them, gave them water, the prisoners stared with disbelief. Everything they had been told was a lie, and that realization revealed a painful truth. The hatred had been manufactured by leaders who wanted war, not by the people who fought it. The atomic bombings finally forced Japan to surrender, sparing both nations from the apocalyptic invasion that had been planned. When Emperor Hirohito spoke to his people, breaking centuries of tradition, he admitted that continuing the war would destroy Japan itself. His words shattered the illusion that death was preferable to surrender. For the Marines who had fought across the Pacific, the war ended, not with triumph, but with exhaustion. They had faced the most relentless soldiers of the modern era, warriors shaped by a culture and system designed to deny fear. The Marines did not forget their bravery nor their brutality. They remembered the faces of men who charged through gunfire with bayonets raised, who fought from caves until flames consumed them, who died believing they were protecting their sacred homeland. And in that memory lies the answer the world often asks. Why did Japanese soldiers hate the Americans so fiercely? Because they were trained to, because they were raised to, because they were told that surrender was a sin, and America was the enemy of their very existence, because they believed their death could save their nation. The war ended, but the story remained, a lesson carved into history by fire, steel, sacrifice, and a clash between two worlds that collided in the vast Pacific, leaving behind a legacy that shaped generations. The Marines returned home, changed forever. The Japanese survivors rebuilt a nation from ashes, and the memory of their battles became a testament to the extremes humanity can reach when ideology, duty, fear, and pride become stronger than life itself. Thus ended one of the fiercest confrontations in human history. War, not just of armies, but of beliefs.